Welcome to part 2 of the Progressive Era. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at minorities and conflict in the workplace. And what we see is that as women found professional careers closed to them, so did minorities. In fact, 8 out of 10 African Americans still lived in the South under sharecropping conditions during this time period. They also experienced segregation, were kept from voting, were denied their rights, paid less, and had a lack of schooling, all which kind of led to very harsh living conditions. Therefore, men like W.E.B. Du Bois, who founded the Niagara movement and the NAACP, started to speak out about the gradualist approach taken by Booker T. Washington, as Washington kind of thought that African Americans should kind of focus on their own economic well-being and getting jobs, and out of that would grow everything else over time. But that's not the approach that Du Bois and others wanted to take. And so in 1905, because they couldn't meet in Niagara, New York, they actually had to meet in Canada. These men kind of started talking about how to try to push for equal rights between whites and blacks. And they kind of focused primarily on African American rights and education. And they kind of thought that all these things should be equal immediately, and they wouldn't stop fighting for them until they got them. But after an outbreak of violence where whites kind of went through black neighborhoods, a new organization was created known as the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And this will lead and continue to lead today the fight for equality, not just in education, but life in general. Du Bois, who was the editor of The Crisis, which was the publication of the NAACP, helped kind of speak out against the issues that African Americans were facing during this time. But now we turn our attention to immigrants. In the early 1900s, regardless of where they came from, these immigrants encountered considerable hostility, especially the new immigrants of Southern and Eastern Europe. If you can imagine what it was like to take a boat across an ocean, and as you kind of disembark and you have to enter these cities and look for jobs and places to live, it could be very difficult and very scary. Very challenging. And what became known as padroni were kind of like labor agents for these immigrants. They helped them find places to work and places to live. But many times these immigrants were taken advantage of by the padroni, kind of charging high prices for their services. But not all immigrants were looking to come and stay permanently. The ones that became known as birds of passage were those who would come work for a period of time on a farm or in some factory or some business, save up some money, and take their earnings back with them from where they came. Some immigrants kind of made the trip back and forth numerous times. So whereas many immigrants chose to stay, there were some that did continue to make that traveling back and forth. And just like there was Ellis Island in New York, there was Angel Island in San Francisco. From 1910 to 1940, over 500,000 Chinese, Russian, Filipino, and Japanese immigrants passed through these doors. Sometimes these immigrants would be housed for months at a time before they could prove they were eligible to enter the United States, where they built ships, levees, irrigation systems, and help with the railroads. However, with more immigrants came a feeling of nativism, kind of trying to limit these Asian and Southeastern Europeans, trying to pass perhaps literacy tests that if they couldn't pass them, they wouldn't be allowed entry. Other detainees were sometimes sent back for various health reasons. But all in all, we kind of took it upon ourselves to try to Americanize these new immigrants, try to teach them our customs, our language, our ways of life, to help them kind of enter in this melting pot that we thought America was. In fact, companies like the Ford Motor Company even provided English classes and tried to teach, about American culture and way of life to their employees. And in one ceremony, as you can see here, some of the new employees that are immigrants or recent immigrants kind of walk up the stairs on one side, down into the old melting pot, and as they enter, they kind of have their traditional clothing, but as they exit the melting pot and come out, they're wearing more of a kind of American style of clothing, showing how they had kind of taken on this new culture. However, during this era, not just because there's more immigrants coming in, but because of the kind of the monotonous, simple, repetitive, kind of non-rewarding work that was being done in these factories, people started wanting to try and improve their lot in life. They maybe tried to fight against the lower pay, the increase in hours, the speed up of the assembly line, which kind of just quickened the pace of which everything moved, which made you work faster, which led to more accidents. And so some workers begin to strike. We see more conflict in the workplace. And throughout most of this industrialization process, government usually kind of tended to side with big business. Kind of what was good for business was good for America because they provided jobs and growth and manufactured products that could be purchased both here and abroad. But things kind of eventually changed throughout this progressive era a little bit as people looked to government to, again, kind of fix some of those, evils or social ills of society. And one way that labor fought back was through the use of their labor unions. In 1900, roughly 1 million Americans belonged to a union, and 20 years later, that was over 5 million. And the largest, probably most significant union was the AFL, or American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, which had over 1.7 million members and was kind of known as a craft union because it organized workers by certain crafts. Maybe it was carpenters, welders, painters, mason workers. They're all kind of organized by what job they did. But regardless, the AFL was kind of reserved for skilled labor, and it was limited primarily to white men, as women and blacks quite often were not allowed into these craft unions of the AFL. But one of the most aggressive and probably therefore most feared was the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies. Created in 1905, it was the most radical labor union, and they actually did accept women and minorities, unskilled, and immigrants. And the one of the founders was William Big Bill Hayward, and his quote, kind of an injury to one is an injury to all, kind of showed how labor should try to come together and have kind of solidarity amongst them. Another kind of leader, this was Mother Mary Harris Jones, as she was known as. They even go as far as to try to overthrow the capitalistic system by resorting to violence and sabotage. And sometimes they might protest working conditions by destroying the equipment that they actually work with. And so you can kind of see how kind of radical of a union this one was. Now this one was much more shorter lived. However, the AFL obviously still exists today. Now, even though some companies, used violence to try to break up strikes or do away with unions, they also kind of implemented like surveillance and kind of wiretappings to try to keep unions from infiltrating their companies. But other companies actually tried to appease the workers by providing better working conditions, trying to provide more job satisfaction, which would affect workers' output. And probably, like I said before, the most or the biggest impact in this area came when Ford offered his $5 day, because it created that stable workforce where people wanted to work for Ford because he paid his workers so well, and therefore their production increased and turnover decreased, and there was kind of an overall job satisfaction that their workers felt. Other companies kind of started forming, kind of parties for birthdays or whatever, providing newsletters, and even kind of creating softball and baseball teams at their companies where they could, go and play together and have picnics. So there was an attempt by some businesses to kind of appease their workers by, kind of providing them with more things to try to keep them happy and working hard, and therefore also keeping unions at bay. And one of these companies that kind of led the way was Amoskeag in New Hampshire. With over 17,000 workers, including many immigrants, the company kind of took a paternalistic approach in dealing with their employees, as they provided playgrounds, nurses, dental services, and parties and picnics, kind of like I mentioned. But all in all, what you see is that these companies that did attempt to try to increase job satisfaction to keep loyal workers that would work hard for the benefit of the company. And again, like I said, that would kind of try to keep the unions from surfacing as well if they improve the conditions kind of on their own. But these are some of the changes that took place during the Progressive Era, and we'll take a look at even more in our next episode.